Okay, that was God Bless America by Irving Berlin. A little ditty brought to you by a man named Israel Beyline, a Eastern European Jewish immigrant who came to the United States and is very much emblematic of the stuff we're here to talk about today in Lesson 7. I am, of course, as always, Mr. Rain, and joining me here is my faithful companion, Mr. Suter.
Yes, just taking a seat because he wasn't warned that we're starting doing this.
Anyhow, we're looking at right now how great were the consequences of the rapid economic, rather rapid rapid immigration on the social and economic growth of industrialization in the late 19th century. That's a mouthful, but I got through it. Anyhow, today we're going to talk about, first and foremost, new immigration. What is new immigration? Well, there are phases of American immigration. The first phase of American immigration came before the Civil War, where most of the immigrants in that particular time, as you may remember learning or us talking about in the past, came from areas in Northern Europe. Okay, we're talking about German immigration, English and Irish immigration. The new immigration tended to come from the Southern European countries, predominantly Italy, and then also from Eastern Europe, areas that would today constitute Poland, but at that point was part of the Greater Russian Empire. And this immigration contrasts pretty drastically with the previous immigration that had mostly come from Britain and Germany. New York City becomes, I suppose, the epicenter of immigration, the big Ellis Island immigration input and sort of naturalization harbor, where the immigrants come off the boat and are processed as immigrants to the United States is there. And a lot of them stay actually in and around the New York City area. By 1890, New York City is the biggest city in North America. 80% of the people living in it were born abroad. It had more Irish people than Dublin. There were more Germans living in New York City than in Hamburg, and more Italians living in New York City than in Naples.
So why did they do it? Well, there are two types of factors, push factors and pull factors. Push factors are the ones which force people from where they currently live to move to new climes. Pull factors being those which attract people to America. So there are a number of ones. We're going to be looking at a couple just now. First one is social economic changes at home. Now, this is not the same thing as being poor. This is that the life that people used to have in their old countries has become usually harder, or at least different or more challenging because of changes to the economy. They might have become more industrialized, they may have a high population, so there's less land, fewer businesses, etc., etc. Something changing in the economy at home which forces people to move abroad. For example, as the population of Europe grows, more people have to move to the cities, and for the people who used to have a nice life in the cities where there wasn't too great a population, or who are used to living in the countryside and now are being forced to move to cities, very often it's an unattractive proposition to stay in, say, Warsaw or Dublin. And instead they move to America in search of a life more accustomed to what they're used to. Although many, therefore, go to US cities, we see a number, particularly the more Western European, the Dutch, the German, and the Swedish, tend to arrive at America, but don't stay too long in the cities. They tend to move outwards into rural areas and continue their sort of more agricultural life as they used to before. Those who chose to live in the cities found it quite easy to make that change, to move all the way to America, because if you're going to move from the rural Germany or rural Italy to urban Italy, that's already a huge change. You might as well move to somewhere like the US, where you're more likely to get a job and have a better quality of life. Another reason, which is very common in the American how they talk about immigration positively and how inclusive they are, is about how they accept people who are being persecuted. Part of the American myth, although this isn't actually true, is that they were founded by people who were persecuted, in this case Puritans, persecuted traveling to New England. That's not true, but they did believe and did encourage this idea that you could come to America for religious tolerance and freedom. Jews who were being targeted in pogroms all across Russia and Eastern Europe very often fled, particularly to places like New York City and the East Coast. Armenians in Turkey after World War I, who were part of the Armenian genocide, or controversially named Armenian genocide, also fled. As well as that, with the fall of World War with the creation of the forces which lead to World War I in particular, so when the Austro-Hungarian Empire starts kicking its heels about, starts oppressing minorities who are not Austrians, very often those minorities such as the Czechs, such as the Bohemians, and in some cases Hungarians, flee Austria-Hungary and move to America where they feel like they get treated a bit better. Now, what happens as well is in Europe, as there is persecution of socialists and anarchists, people who believe there shouldn't be a government, they find that it's not safe to live in these European countries, particularly those of Southern and Eastern Europe, and they flee to America where they believe that there's going to be more political toleration of them. That turns out to be a tragic
Yeah, as we'll learn in a few lessons down the road, a lot of these anarchists, socialists who are rabble rousers, trouble starters in areas of Europe end up coming to America and starting the same trouble in America, only to find that they are met with the same sort of hostility in the United States as they were at home. So why did so many people want to leave the countries in which they were born and lived? Okay, another reason could be economic. Okay, probably the most dramatic example of economic migrants are the Irish, who left in the thousands during the 1840s and the subsequent decades following the potato famine. The potato, of course, being the primary crop of Ireland. When that fails in the 1840s, very famously, millions of Irish leave the islands, leave the island of Ireland, I should say, via boat. The majority of those head to the United States and set up life there in a new country because it wasn't sustainable to do so in Ireland anymore. Most others who don't come for any of the aforementioned reasons will trace their motive to some sort of economic collapse. In the 1880s, a lot of Italians, particularly in the South, leave Italy as the sort of the fruit market dies. There's a combination of both cholera and the fact that Italians who grow fruits, predominantly grapes, actually find no market for their grapes in the 1880s for a host of various reasons. But anyways, make a long story short, Southern Italians start fleeing in large numbers because they can no longer farm sustainably in Italy. So they go and choose America, where many of their sort of relatives and friends have gone. As a consequence of America being what it is, there are a number of reasons why people would be pushed towards America, but equally there needs to be a combination of things that are attractive about the United States. And I'll run through three of them right now. The first is economic opportunity. Okay, this is probably the most obvious reason. The U.S. has a justified reputation as a land of opportunity. Industry, as we know, is booming. And there's a huge demand for labor, particularly unskilled labor that doesn't require specialized training to work in the factories and so on. So what appears for many people, especially in America, as a low-paying job, actually, when you compare to how little they were paid in southern Italy or in Russia for that matter, this seems like an absolute fortune. So for immigrants, they're happy to come. They're happy to take these low-paying jobs. There's an issue of direct recruitment. Of course, we've heard about this before. During the Civil War, there was an immigration bureau established that continues its work throughout the Gilded Age, and their goal is to bring immigrants to America. Immigrants increase the domestic market, increase the amount of need for American-made products, et cetera, et cetera. But the railroads and the shipping companies begin to start paying for people to come over. It's a huge seller. If you're a European railroad transporting someone from the interior of Russia to a port such as the one in Rome or a port like Southampton here in England, requires them to buy train tickets. And long-distance train travel is expensive. And these people made a lot of money off this great migration of people. Not only that, if you own a steamship company, many of whom are connected with railroads, and you want to ship thousands of people across the ocean, you are going to profit. So they start advertising America. And in many ways, America's job is done for it by companies that wish to make huge amounts of money off this massive migration. Toleration. Most Europeans were denied the vote. Most Eastern European governments were autocratic monarchies. There was almost no political freedom in most of the countries in Europe, apart from particularly France, maybe England to a degree. And the United States starts to look very attractive with things like all men are created equal enshrined in the Constitution. There was a very, very famous poem that's put forth towards the end of the century by Emma Lazarus, which gets worldwide publication, which says, "Give us your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." And people really legitimately buy this myth. And they believe that America is a land of economic opportunity, of wealth, where the streets are paved with gold. And it is a place where you, depending on no matter who you are, Jew, Gentile, whatever, will be tolerated for who you are in this skills you bring to this country.
Another sort of or more prosaic reasons are about the influence from relatives and friends. Very often, it's quite a jump if you just decided one day to go to America and then go to a random city and try and set up your life.
Just as an aside, you can't go home at this time. There's no airplanes. If you get on a boat and you cross the ocean, you're probably not going back.
I mean, please don't interrupt me, just so you know.
Well, if I have something to say,
so essentially, what generally happens is everyone has a relative, and very often this is a very dubiously extended relatives, a cousin of a cousin's mother's aunts, friends from next doors, etc. place. But these people, because they are the only Italian or the only Jew or the only Dutch person who has been in that particular city, very often these people encourage and sometimes even pay for the fare of that immigrant to come over, on the expectation that the immigrant pays back once they arrive after a bit of working. So this becomes such a huge thing that by 1901, 65% of all immigrants are paid for, and their tickets over are paid for by friends and relatives in the USA, and to make them come over. And the idea is once they arrive and they've paid off their tickets, they will then in turn do it to one of their relatives, and so on and so on, and that only encourages more people. And that's a massive pull factor. If you don't have to really pay that much or pay at all initially to come over, why not? And the other one is even more sort of basic. It's the idea of transportation. Before the 1890s, around about 1850, 95% of all immigrants came by sail. The ships are slow, they're very old, they're very expensive, therefore to sail because they take a long time and you have to pay for a lot of time. Steamships by 1880 were far more common. You could cross the Atlantic in a matter of days. And because of that, the charges you had to pay, and also the size of the ships, and therefore the amount of stuff and people you could fit in there, and therefore the cheaper you could make it, were much greater. So now you had shorter, quicker, cheaper crossing times. That lower fares means that poorer immigrants from poorer countries can make their way across. And what we find is many large European steamship companies really start developing almost a recruitment drive to encourage people to buy these tickets. They are invested in encouraging immigrants to try and move over to America because they will pay for the ship crossing. So what you get is agents sent out from these steamship companies saying, look how wonderful America is. You should definitely come. By the way, take our boat. They get the business, but also immigrants tend to move across. And as you can see there, one particular steamship company in the 1890s has over 3,000 agents in Germany and Poland trying to recruit people, not because they care much about America, more because they want people to pay for the tickets.
It's very useful at this particular point to take a breath and consider how we've gone about laying this out. The first bit could be a very easy 10-mark question. Why was immigration so prominent in the United States in the later part of the 19th century? This next bit looks at another potential 10-mark question, such as what was the impact of this mass new migration and new immigration in the later part of the 19th century? And we'll take this in stages. Each stage could indeed form its own paragraph if you were to make an argument around this. It's going to be up to you really to think of the significance, but we'll give you some hints. Now, the first impact, of course, is where they settled. And it's this creation of what are known as ethnic enclaves, particularly in the north and northeastern cities of the United States. Immigrants almost always congregate in America's industrial cities because one of the big pull factors, of course, is cheap labor. And you go where there is industry. And they happen to be in the industrial cities of the Northeast. By 1910, 1/3 of the population of the 12 largest cities is foreign-born, and another third is made up of the children of recent immigrants. As I've mentioned, New York has more Italians than Naples, more Jews than the whole of Western Europe. Only 5% of immigrants will settle in the South. The South and their old traditional ways is relatively hostile to new immigrants, and they don't necessarily find that a welcoming place to settle. And as a consequence also of the fact that ethnic communities are established, it is more comfortable for immigrants to settle within ethnic enclaves where people speak their own language, have similar traditions, share religious practices. You have access to, if you're a Jew, synagogues if you're a Roman Catholic churches. If you go out into the middle of nowhere, you're not necessarily going to have that pre-existing support group made of people from the homeland.
If you want to add a bit more depth there, you can also point out that the types of immigrants and the racial groups are very much clustered around particular northern enclaves or particular enclaves. For example, in the West, San Francisco, in Los Angeles, there's a large Chinese population because obviously that's closer to get to from China than the East. As well as that, around the Great Lakes, Chicago, very strong Irish population. So
not only that, but also Poles and Eastern Europeans.
Fantastic. So because of that, and because they locate in different areas, they locate in different types of industry, we see them concentrating in different types of jobs. Poles and Hungarians, by finding themselves in the Virginias, find themselves near the Appalachian Mountains, they tend to find themselves mining. Had they decided to go to Illinois, they would be in the meatpacking trade. But because a couple of Polish people happen to be in areas where there's mining, and they invite their friends and other Poles go to those same areas, they become the mining people. It's not because they really chose to do mining or that they're naturally good at mining. They happen to be in areas, and then that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Russian and Polish Jews, by the fact they're in the northeast, particularly New York cities, those industries for low-skilled workers are dominated by the garment trade, making clothes. Most clothes-making factories are in those northeast cities, and therefore naturally, since there are lots of Russian and Polish Jews in America in those cities, they tend to concentrate on those trades. Italians tend to dominate construction work. This is more because the businesses are run by Italians and they like to recruit Italians. As well as that, if you look at more broadly, agriculture in America, it tends to be more German and Western European run because generally, A, they have the skill set, B, they tend to be a bit richer, so they can buy the land to sort of make farms, etc., etc. So the Midwest rural regions tend to be more dominated by Germans, Dutch, Swedish, as mentioned before. And as mentioned on the last slide, Chinese workers in the West in particular, where all the railroads are still being built, or most railroads are still being built, are Chinese. Now, had China not been there, or had all the railways been built, you wouldn't find Chinese people naturally going to the East Coast just to build railroads. But because where they happen to land, and because building railways is a low skill, they tend to dominate building the railways. So the key thing to point at is there seems to be specialized industries. That's not because of choice, that's because of where they happen to be. Now, the big emphasis of why they do this low-skilled work is because immigrant labor is cheap. Because you can have all these people who don't have skills but are willing to basically be paid anything just to survive, they see themselves as almost building enough capital so their children can have a better opportunity. What we find is, in areas where they come in, the average wage falls. Before, when you only got American people to pay wages, they won't accept low wages. Now you have all these immigrants come in, you can charge less for wages. If the Americans don't want to pay, you'll find some immigrant to replace them. So the average wage for the unskilled cotton mill worker falls from $2.49 to $2.18 over the course of 10 years. That is on top of the fact that immigrants you can treat far worse in terms of employment. You can make them work long hours, you can exploit them, you can not give them breaks, and you don't have to pay money to make the conditions nicer because you know they are desperate for the salary, they are desperate for the wage, and they are more willing to accept these, partly because life was so hard where they were from, partly because they see this as a temporary thing. An example of when this goes tragically wrong is the 1911 Triangle Fire. Triangle was a factory making garments. Because they didn't have breaks, because the bosses didn't actually want them to leave their positions until it was too late, and because all the fire exits weren't fire exits, they were all locked or not actually fire exits, a lot of people died. 196 people were killed. So in reality, this provision of cheap labor for unskilled work has been argued to be absolutely key to making America the world power. Warren Mass, historian, for example, argues that the growth of the United States into a major world power depended on getting sufficient population. Without immigration, there is no way you have that amount of workers in order to get that population.
Okay, one of the other interesting ones is the notion of political realignment. We had known up until this point that the Democrats, for instance, had always been the party of the South and the Republicans the party of the North. Now, immigration begins to change this. I'm just going to make a quick aside right now. This is probably not the most significant impact of immigration during the Gilded Age. It's something that has its impact much later down the road, but the process of political realignment begins during this time. One of the reasons is that uh, these immigrants who had very few experiences of politics, most of them come from places where there was a king or a czar or something like that, and therefore they couldn't have the vote. They tend to vote in line with their region. They don't vote on sort of national programs. They don't things they don't understand. They vote about what can help them in the immediate. And the fact that most of these people lived in enclaves, Italians in Little Italy and New York, et cetera, meant that they start to dominate local districts. And local politicians, if they're keen, will begin to exploit large immigrant populations. One really good example is in New York City and the Democrats. New York City has traditionally, until this particular point, been 100% a Republican stronghold. Now, during the Gilded Age, local politicians start to form themselves into sort of political groups such as Tammany Hall that represents the Democrats, and the bosses of these political groups will seek to make inroads into politics by providing economic and social support in exchange for votes. This starts to concern people. They start to see that as corruption, and the party bosses have infiltrated the American political system, giving people food in exchange for the votes, giving them better fire service instead of the votes. Many are also concerned that since the new immigrants were Catholic, okay, that these people also didn't owe their loyalty to America. That sort of somehow the Jeffersonian ideal that people vote for the benefit of the whole of America has been undermined not only by these party bosses, but by the idea that they owed their allegiance to the Pope in Rome, not the United States of America, which was traditionally founded on a very Protestant ethos. The Democratic Party is probably the biggest example of a party that influences or at least uses these new immigrant enclaves to try and gain support. The Republican dominance of government after the Civil War starts to become threatened by the end of the Gilded Age, not in a very, very big way, but it is threatened because these immigrants are voting in blocks largely for the Democrats, who through party bosses, et cetera, are starting to hoover up lots of votes and becoming congressmen and senators and so on and so forth.
Another argument is that by introducing people of different cultures, they bring along their food, their art, their music, and that enriches the American culture. American culture before arguably is quite dull and quite Anglo-Saxon, quite Puritan, so relatively lacking in a depth and a sort of exotic range of stuff. And by bringing in these immigrants who gradually bring their food and gradually get involved in cultural things such as art and music, they enliven American culture. So, for example, a lot of the classic quintessential American things you have today, such as the hot dog or the Frankfurter, came from German immigrants, as did much of their beer industry came from Germans who have been immigrated in. You have the pizza coming from Italians living in New York. It wasn't necessarily actually an Italian thing back in Italy, but they adopting the same thing, which then spread like wildfire. So much in the way of food and other things came from immigrants. Without immigration, that would not have been a benefit. As well as that, in terms of art, the music scene. Irving Berlin wrote White Christmas, Easter Parade, God Bless America,
which we heard off the top.
Absolutely right. And so without immigration, these artists won't have necessarily developed. As well as that, playwrights, composers on Broadway, which is where all the theatre land is of America and New York, they often were written by recent immigrants, but quite a lot of Jewish immigrants in particular, write these shows. And again, they provide support and development for the American cultural life of people who go there. The important thing to realize, though, is in reality, for the vast majority of Americans who don't live in urban areas where they can afford to go to Broadway, they can afford this luxury or exotic food and drink, this does not necessarily help them as much. If you are a cowboy in Texas, you are unlikely to be touched by immigrant culture, at least during the Gilded Age. Perhaps afterwards, as the world, America becomes more diverse, the sort of wealth begins to travel. But at this point, we can say the cultural benefits are limited for those who happen to live in areas where immigrants are and happen to have the money and the inclination to explore these cultures.
Okay, so from the perspective of the pizza and hot dog loving man that I am myself, I would probably not find any of the immigration that offensive. However, for many Americans, considering who call themselves the natives, if you will, the opposition to immigration and foreign-born people begins to increase with the amount of foreign-born people who come in. By 1910, you have 14% of the U.S. population, almost 15%, in fact, foreign-born. A lot of these people were easily the targets of scorn. They were poor, they were less skilled, they were less literate than the old stock Americans. Many of them didn't really like democracy. America's founded on this idea of democracy, and many of them are strangers to it. They don't vote, or they vote in weird ways, or they vote against their self-interests. They sell their votes to the party bosses. And Americans start to doubt whether they could successfully assimilate, whether or not there was something called too much immigration. So some of these old immigrants, okay, the people who had come, and of course this is an immigrant-based country, start to view and look at the new immigrants as a scapegoat, someone they can blame for the ills of society, someone they think is responsible for turning America into a more corrupt, a more violent, and less homogenous, well-knit society, something that's tearing apart the social fabric. So what you have at the late part of the 19th century is a wave of nativism. And a nativism is a term that means hostility towards the immigrants. Okay, this belief that the natives are better, the people who've been here for a while. In 1869, for example, 5 Italians are lynched in Tallulah, Louisiana, and that was because they were associating with Black Americans who they found and were approaching on equal terms. Of course, the Italians didn't have the latent racism in the South that existed since the Civil War, and 5 Italians are lynched for just talking to Black people. In 1887, the American Protective Association has to be formed, and it has the aim of countering the impact of Catholics on public schools. People feared that America's ideals, America's founding ethos would be subverted by Catholics who would undermine it and make Americans loyal to the Pope, and Americans would then naturally start taking orders from Rome and not America. It seems ridiculous, but people truly did believe this. The race of immigrants, it's important to note, also determines the harshness in which they're treated. So nuance is incredibly important when making this point. It is fair to say that the immigrant group that faced the biggest backlash were the Chinese. Something known as sinophobia, fear of the Oriental people, Chinese people, takes place throughout America. So much so that the Americans actually passed a law known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which forbids all further Chinese immigration. And something, not a government organization, but a group of people in California formed the Asiatic Exclusion League, which aims to pressure or lobby government to remove Asians from America altogether, to effectively deport all Chinese people, the people who had in fact built their railroads. So it would be wrong, in a sense, to paint America as a nation that was wholly intolerant of immigrants. In fact, there are tremendous success stories, much of which we've already talked about. But the fact that there is some is a troubling concern. I would say, however, that opposition to immigration is probably less than we can than at least it would appear on its surface. Certainly, there are big examples of it, but they don't have a humongous impact. And that is, of course, except for the measures taken against the Chinese. The fact that vast numbers arrive. And the examples of intolerance are relatively few, shows that, especially compared to other eras, things are okay in America regarding to toleration of immigration. Author and historian Hugh Brogan states that the fact that, there is such large-scale immigration was able to happen is notable evidence of the essential liberalism of the American political institutions, the fact that Americans were open, liberal, and accepting.
So, how far did the USA benefit from the immigration? Well, as already mentioned, the migrants from Europe were encouraged. However, Chinese immigration was not. So you can argue that indeed Chinese immigration perhaps was less helpful than European immigration because it was obviously stopped, and some Americans believed that immigration. That's the same bloody.
Screw this up.
Well, obviously, apologies for that. Apologies for the flaw. I got confused by Mr. Rain's terrible syntax here, and the question does not link to it. What he informs me that this is a summary slide of what's going on. So let's try it as a summary slide. In summary, migrants in Europe were encouraged. However, Chinese immigration was not, and therefore there is a hypocrisy. If I'm going to add to what Ms. Rain says, in reality there is very strict hierarchical ordering. If you were a Western European immigrant, you were largely accepted as one of the right ones, particularly if you're a Protestant. If you were Irish, you were lower than an English person, but still higher than an Italian. If you're an Italian, you're lower than the Irish, but higher than the Jew or the Eastern European, and so on. At the very bottom of the pile is the Chinese immigrant. So it is not as clear and not as simple as saying immigrants were good or immigrants are bad. Immigrants had hostility, immigrants didn't. It depended who you were and where you were. If you're in the North and Midwest, because most of you are there, you are therefore going to dominate the culture, and therefore there's going to be less intolerance against you. Therefore, when we look at how did they help, we've looked at the economic side of stuff. We've looked at how they helped the country industrialize. However, you can also argue perhaps their impact on American society, at least in the numbers that they came, or in a very short period of time, actually caused negative effects. When you have so many people coming to particular areas where all their other country folk are very quickly, you very quickly get ghettos, urban areas where lots of poor people of the same culture live, and it becomes very discouraged, rightly or wrongly, for other people to enter there. And landlords in particular, and city bosses, as we've seen before, exploit this concentration of immigrants, very often who are very poor and don't really care so much about the American democratic or legal system as someone who's lived there for a long time. We also see a lot of organized crime evolving in these areas, where particular Italians will take control of the Italian neighborhood and then branch out. And as well as that, as mentioned previously, corruption is institutionalized. If you are the strong man, that means the most important Italian in the Italian district, and you can deliver 90% of the votes of the Italians for any election, you will get money, which you'll pass down to Italians, and the politicians who buy your vote don't actually need to be good or need to be positive or even need to care about the people, so long as they buy the Italian ward's votes. And most American politicians in urban areas often talk about buying the Italian vote, buying the Eastern European vote, and this perhaps has a negative effect on democracy, meaning the people who are richest become politicians rather than the best. As well as that, the idea of hyphenated Americans, Italian Americans, the German Americans are less so, but Jewish Americans is certainly a big thing. A well-known fact, to be honest, is the American university system is very different to ours, partly because they wanted to keep Jews out of universities, and they felt that entrance exam based stuff, rather than taking into account sport and stuff, helped Jews unnecessarily. But by allowing immigrants to settle in the common areas, by giving them a sense of identity, you are an Italian American, you are a Jewish American, you are a Polish American, as opposed to you are an American, and as opposed to people going across and diversifying and entering other cultures and other communities of different countrymen, that leads to division and hostility between different Americans. And so because when immigrants come, they don't integrate, that stores up problems for the future. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt criticized Italians for not seeking to integrate with other members of American society and creating differences and problems in the inner cities.
Okay, so that was an effective summary after all. Thank you, Mr. Suter. Now, anyways, to make a long story short, that's all we got for immigration for today. Make sure that you get a sense of which is important, which is not, and think about the ways that this can be used in questions.